Assalamu alaikum, Sabal Hair, Shukran Jazilan for this opportunity to share a few words with you and to share the stage with two distinguished ministers of foreign affairs and with the great leader of IISS. And congratulations to Team IISS, John, on another great gathering here in this great kingdom, and thanks to our Bahraini hosts for their characteristically warm hospitality once again. As I stand here this morning, I cannot help but to think back to December of 2008, when I first addressed the Manama Dialogue as the new commander of U.S. Central Command. I'd only recently left Iraq after a total of 4 years in the Balad Rafidain, the land of the two rivers, where the efforts of the U.S.-led coalition and our Iraqi partners had defeated both al-Qaeda and associated Sunni insurgent groups and the Shia militia elements supported by Iran that had plagued Basra, Qadamiyya, Sadr City, and other locations. And it's great to see former Prime Minister Alawi and a number of other old friends and colleagues, including now Commander of U.S. Central Command, General Joe Votel, who at that time was working with Special Ops, as we all came together to achieve that progress. Violence in Iraq, by the time I stood at this stage, was down by some 85 or 90%. The U.S. was gradually reducing its forces for that effort, and we were beginning to transition to a greater focus and greater resources in the fight against the Taliban, al-Qaeda, and the Haqqani network in Afghanistan, pirates off the shores of Somalia, al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula in Yemen, and the rapidly developing Iranian nuclear program. Each effort was going reasonably well, and we were on the verge of returning to Bahrain dependents, children of U.S. service members assigned here, symbolic of how well it was all going. And although the price of oil had plummeted during 2008 as we entered the Great Recession, it was soon to recover, and the overall situation elsewhere in the region was reasonably stable by comparison to today. Today, of course, despite the impressive progress by Iraqi forces, advised, assisted, and enabled by a U.S.-led coalition against ISIS, and despite progress by Syrian defense forces against ISIS in parts of Syria, the situation in the region is very, very difficult. Continued challenges by terrorist cells and insurgent remnants of ISIS in Iraq, a resurgence of Iranian-supported militias there, and serious political discord between Baghdad and Erbil and within the KRG. As I've noted before, in fact, the battle after the battle in Iraq, the competition for political power and resources after the defeat of ISIS, may well prove more challenging than the defeat of ISIS once the U.S. and coalition countries committed to support their Iraqi brothers. Here we must work and support inclusive governance rather than the exclusive governance that once again alienated the Sunni parts of the country after the U.S. withdrawal in late 2011. There's continued fighting in Syria, of course, a geopolitical Chernobyl, a meltdown of a country where considerable progress has been made against ISIS in the northeast and east, but where serious extremist elements remain in Idlib and considerable fighting continues between the factions of the civil war. Here, too, the political struggles will undoubtedly prove to be enormously challenging, and it is not entirely clear at this point that Syria can be put back together again. There is, to be sure, a halt of and a reduction in some elements of the Iranian nuclear program, but there's also an Iran benefiting to a degree from the economic incentives associated with that deal and a missile program that continues unabated. There is also, of course, considerable presence of Iranian-supported militia and forces in Syria, Iraq, Lebanon, Yemen, and elsewhere, as Iran seeks to Lebanonize Iraq and Syria in particular, in order to solidify its efforts to establish the Shia Crescent and a ground line of communications from Tehran through Iraq and Syria to southern Lebanon. There is, as Sheikh Khalid noted, a Houthi-precipitated civil war in Yemen, where al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula and Ibrahim al-Asiri, still the world's most dangerous man, are still active, and where the situation was exceedingly challenging before the civil war began. There's turmoil in Libya between secular and Islamist factions, and also the presence of resilient ISIS elements there. There are continued terrorist and economic challenges in Tunisia, the one country that did come out of the Arab Spring with reasonably stable and also, I might note, democratic governance. There are lingering terrorist and economic challenges in Egypt. There's a return of Russian forces to the region. Indeed, there are 4 revolutions ongoing in the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, started by the leadership of that kingdom, in governance, in social and religious terms, in economic development, and in foreign policy. And we must hope that there are successful outcomes in each of these, given the importance of the kingdom to the entire region. There is, as was noted, a serious internal dispute in the GCC, and this is all in a backdrop of reduced resources available to the major oil and gas producing countries of the region, and thus reduced resources to the region due to lingering low energy prices, which do not seem likely to increase significantly in the year or two ahead, despite the ongoing synchronous global economic recovery. There is, in brief, no shortage of challenges, though I do want to highlight one heartening feature that is still present in the region that I described when I was CENTCOM commander back in 2008. And that is that the Emirati Air Force can still defeat that of Iran. If anything, in fact, it is even better now than it was then after continuous combat operations, first in Afghanistan, where I was privileged to have Emiratis under my command, and more recently, of course, in Yemen. Given this backdrop, 9 tough years after the end of the surge in Iraq and 16 years into the fight against Islamic extremists on the ground in the region, it would be wise, I think, to ask what lessons we might take from our experiences. And I'll do this from a U.S. perspective, noting there are 5 that I believe should guide our policymaking and actions, together with our coalition partners and the host nations we are seeking to assist. First, it is increasingly apparent that ungoverned spaces in a region stretching from West Africa through the Middle East into Central Asia will be exploited by Islamic extremists who want to establish sanctuaries in which they can enforce their extremist version of Islam and from which they can conduct terrorist attacks into areas around them and beyond. It is thus not a question of if, it is a question of when Islamist extremists will exploit such areas. And I would contend that the same is true with respect to malign Iranian activity in Shia areas of the region. Second, it is also apparent that we have to take action in such situations, as Las Vegas rules do not apply in these areas. What happens there does not stay there. Rather, as in the case of the meltdown of the country that is Syria, the actions of the extremist groups are likely to spew violence, instability, extremism, and a tsunami of refugees well beyond their immediate surroundings and all the way into the countries of our NATO allies in Europe, thus posing increasingly difficult domestic security and political challenges for our partners in the region, our European allies, and even our own homeland. This is, in short, not a problem that can be dealt with in the way that Washington sometimes tries to do, admiring the problem until it goes away. It is not going to go away, and action inevitably has to be taken. Third, it's also increasingly clear that in responding to these challenges, U.S. leadership is imperative. If the U.S. does not lead, it's unlikely that another country will. Moreover, no group of other countries at this point collectively even remotely approach U.S. capabilities that can enable host nation forces. This doesn't mean that the U.S. needs to undertake enormous efforts in each case to counter extremist groups in the region highlighted. To the contrary, the U.S. should only do what is absolutely necessary, and we should do so with as many partners and coalition members as possible. Churchill was right when he observed that the only thing worse than fighting with allies is fighting without them. And if one of those partners wants to walk point, such as the French in Mali, we should support it and recognize that we still have to contribute substantially from a U.S. perspective. By the way, partners from the Islamic world are of particular importance. Indeed, they have huge incentives to be involved, as the ongoing struggles are generally not clashes between civilizations. Rather, what we are seeing is more accurately a clash within a civilization, that of the Islamic world. And no leaders have more to lose should extremism gather momentum than those of predominantly Islamic states. Fourth, it's becoming clear that the approach the U.S. and coalition partners pursue with local partners and forces has to be a comprehensive one, not just a narrow counterterrorist approach. We have to recognize a paradox, in fact, that we cannot counter terrorist organizations like ISIS and Al-Qaeda with just counter-terrorist force operations. We cannot drone strike or Delta Force raid our way out of this problem. A comprehensive civil military campaign is needed with all of the elements present in the surge in Iraq, but without the U.S. providing all of those elements. The U.S. does not, therefore, have to provide the conventional ground forces, conduct the political reconciliation component, or undertake the nation-building tasks necessary in such cases, though they will support them, to be sure. In Iraq at present, for example, it's clear that the Iraqis not only should provide those components, they have to do so if the results achieved, with considerable help from the U.S.-led coalition, are to be sustainable. Fifth, and finally, it's clear that we're engaged in a generational struggle, not the fight of a decade, much less a few years. Hence, the U.S.-led effort will have to be sustained for what may be extended periods of time, and reductions in our levels of effort should be guided by conditions on the ground rather than by fixed timetables. To sustain such a commitment will require that our approach is, of course, sustainable, and sustainability is measured in terms of blood and treasure. And it appears that we are able to develop approaches that meet that test. Additionally, while aspirational timelines for reductions in our efforts may have some merit, it's clear from our experiences under both U.S. post-9/11 presidential administrations that premature transitions and drawdowns can result in loss of the progress for which we sacrifice greatly and may result in having to return to a country to avoid a setback to U.S. interests, as was the case in Iraq. Now, there is nothing easy about what I described. Success in all such efforts will, again, require sustained commitment, and not just of our military forces, but of the capabilities of other U.S. departments and agencies and those of coalition partners and allies as well. But I do believe we can fashion sustainable strategies, and in fact, I think that we have been doing that in the past couple of years, led, again, by commanders at U.S. Central Command, now, of course, General Joe Votel, and also by his partners in a variety of different U.S. departments and agencies. Now, a sustained, comprehensive approach is neither easy nor cheap, but neither are the actions we have to take should inadequately governed spaces become ungoverned and then exploited by transitional extremists, and the same being true of malign Iranian activities in Shia areas. It's thus time that we recognize that the long war is going to be an ultramarathon. But it's also time to recognize that we and our allies and partners do have the ability to respond in a thoughtful, prudent manner, informed by the big ideas that I have just described. Nothing less will prove adequate. My overarching conclusion from the challenges in the region that I described and the lessons that I think we should have learned after 16 years of fighting extremists and countering malign Iranian activities is that the U.S. role has never been more important. This is true whether we're leading coalition countries in training, equipping, advising, assisting, and enabling host nation and regional forces in various countries to combat extremists and other malign elements. Working with a coalition of countries to prevent proliferation and determine what comes after the end of the Iran nuclear agreement, and to counter Iranian malign activity in the region as well. Ensuring freedom of navigation through the Gulf to ensure that oil and gas produced in this region can still continue to fuel the global economy. Helping nations that should be allies resolve their disputes. Contributing in accordance with the desires of various countries to the establishment of inclusive and responsive governments in order to resolve internal disputes. Continuing to promote the global rules-based international order and institutions that, however imperfect, have worked reasonably well since the end of the Second World War and now the Cold War, and which have major implications for the situation in this region. And a new task, and a more pressing one, working together to combat propagation of extremist thought in the virtual caliphate in cyberspace. When it comes to a specific U.S. approach, let me revisit a concept I described in 2008 and repeated in 2009, that of multi-bilateralism, a concept in which the U.S. and perhaps select coalition partners works bilaterally with countries in the region that may not be willing to work multilaterally. To stitch together increasingly important defensive and deterrent capabilities to counter the extremist, militia, missile, piracy, and other threats in the region, and in doing all of this, not just with military capabilities, but also with diplomatic, economic, financial, and other tools available as well. My hope is that the superb national security team supporting the U.S. President, and we have Colonel Dr. Joel Rayburn with us from the President's National Security Team, the senior director responsible for Iran, Iraq, Syria, and Lebanon, a team that includes numerous individuals with many years in this region, will indeed continue along a path such as this with even greater energy and focus, building on the relationship between the U.S. and key countries in the region that has been strengthened over the course of the past year, during which progress has been made on various battlefields, but where we know the challenges that lie ahead are very substantial and also very consequential. That is hugely important, as the U.S. vital national interests in this region are arguably even more important now than when I addressed this gathering in 2008 and 2009 as the commander of U.S. CENTCOM. I've spoken today about situations in a region where numerous partnerships are countering mutual security threats. As I've done so, I've been mindful of the unique history of a region that stretches back to antiquity itself. One lesson we may draw from the sweep of that great history is that when various elements of the region have interacted and worked together, the whole has evolved to be greater than the sum of the various parts, as all benefit from sharing and partnership. This is, in fact, a bit like the effect of the spread of one of history's great mathematical discoveries, the Arab invention of cipher, the notation for zero, an invention from which all, including the West, gained enormously as it was shared. We've all come a long way in the 10 centuries since that invention, and our collective progress since that time has shown that when all work together, developments in various spheres are not zero-sum propositions. Frequently, where there is cooperation, as one has gained, so have others, and that is especially true when all work together. When we labor cooperatively, our fortunes invariably rise in concert, and it's my hope that our actions in the year ahead will reflect keen awareness of that reality. Shukran jazilan.